Again, I'm very happy to be here, presenting in my new kind of intellectual habitat at LATS. Perhaps just to quickly respond to some of the very interesting insights that Justus provided, especially with regards to this relation between borders and reactions and how they seem to sort of actually it's a quite I found it as a very geographical approach. You just basically go where frictions are likely to arise, and I guess in another thing that I find very sort of useful and insightful is that in understanding these sort of particular mobilizations, particular events, one actually has to also kind of contextualize, look at the before and after of these events, and how what kind of basically context they unfold within. And perhaps this is where I could kind of pick up on with what I will be presenting today. So this comes out mostly of a paper that I've written with my colleague Sinan Erensu, and here we basically took the event, the Gezi uprising in 2013, which kind of shook Turkey in 2013, and tried to use that as a lens to understand, the importance of space and spatial imaginaries for understanding, for making sense of the currently sort of seemingly generalizing urban condition. So the story, the major story basically begins in May of 2013 with a handful of activists struggling to protect Gezi Park, which is the most centrally located public park in Istanbul, from bulldozers and schemes to transform it into a commercial complex. And rather unexpectedly, the spiral of excessive police violence and ever-increasing number of protesters taking to the streets rapidly escalated into round-clock street clashes, and in a matter of few days, what started as kind of modest sit-in turned into a full-fledged anti-governmental riot that swept most of Turkey. And eventually, Gezi Park itself, the locus of the conflict, was occupied by thousands to create what was later, and nowadays increasingly nostalgically, referred to as the Gezi Commune. And various factors were emphasized before and right after following the event to explain the revolt, such as increasing authoritarianism, rising Islamism, and the Justice and Development Party's, the AKP's urban policies. And the discussion still goes on, even today. And in this paper, what we maintain is that there is actually, analyzing an overdetermined event such as the Gezi revolt poses lots of methodological challenges in terms of disentangling effects and causes, because at a certain moment they just sort of enter into this autocatalytic loop, they interact with each other. So basically we took perhaps an easier route, and we just proposed to use it as a vantage point from which to understand the political work that space does in the context of the increasing salience of speculation-driven and authoritarian interventions in space. And of course, there is nothing new about wealth extraction and redistribution based on urban land rent in Istanbul and in many other cities across the world, especially in the 1980s, in the context of the liberal shock therapy that Turkey was undergoing, and well into the 1990s, there were concerted efforts to turn Istanbul into a business and tourist-friendly space. And this was part and parcel of the elite's ambition to transform Istanbul into a world-class city. Yet, since the mid-2000s, and under the rule of the AKP, there seems to have been a qualitative leap in this direction. So construction and real estate have become both the major economic engine and the main pillar of AKP's success narrative. So these are actually now the backbone of a nationalist, neo-Ottomanist rhetoric presented as the envy of the rest of the world. So the main narrative is that everyone is jealous, they're trying to take us down because we're building all these great bridges and constructing all these great dams. So Gezi uprising, in a way, as a political event, disrupted this developmentalist narrative and defied the presumed consensus over real estate and infrastructure-led economic growth policies. It also articulated many place-based mobilizations across the urban-rural continuum that came before it. And even today, I mean, under very grim conditions in Turkey, the Gezi spirit still continues to inspire various movements and mobilizations. So today, what I'll do is, in the rest of the presentation, is to foreground the main argument. I will first engage with some recent debates around the generalization of the urban condition and its political implications. I will then focus on the case of Istanbul and particularly on the Gezi uprising. And in doing so, I will particularly focus on the spatialities of Gezi, and I will talk about three aspects. So the first is the political economy of space. The second is the political role of space in enabling demonstration of dissensus. And the third aspect relates to spatiality of political imaginaries. So these three aspects. And with the spatiality of political imaginaries, we emphasize the notion of a Turkish word, yaşam alanı, which translates kind of in a rather unsavory fashion into life space. And this phrase has been widely invoked by activist groups before, during, and after the Gezi revolt. And we take that as a prominent instance of space as a mode of political thinking. And this we borrow from Mustafa Dikeç. And finally, I will focus on the aftermath of Gezi and the various ways in which it continued to articulate the political field through various de- and relocalizations across space. So to start with the kind of the larger conceptual meta-theoretical debates around urban theory and urban studies, and there, I mean, already a few of the speakers have already mentioned some of those, and there have been clearly a reanimation of debates as to what should constitute the object of urban theory production. And here I will focus on one area of quite dynamic kind of debates, and this is the increasing salience of the urban as a ubiquitous social spatial formation and a dominant mode of living. So in academic and popular discourses, this has been typically conveyed by the seemingly inexorable and irreversible rise in the portion of population living in cities, urban centers, and discourses around urban futures, urban age, urban society. And in an effort to conceptualize the multidimensionality and increasing predominance of urbanization, some scholars have drawn on Henri Lefebvre's writings in the 1970s on the notion of urban revolution. For instance, Brenner and Schmid highlight the simultaneous forces of concentration and extension and the increasingly uneven and polycentric nature of urban formations. Other urbanists, such as Andy Merrifield and Ed Soja, have pointed out the increasing territorial complexity of contemporary urbanization and the continual extension of the urban fabric. So while I find these debates quite inspiring, what interests me really is, in understanding this, the urban revolution, what interests me most is the increasing prominence of capital and wealth accumulation based on urban land rent, namely urban-based accumulation. And as a perhaps hypothesis, increasing decoupling of urban-based accumulation from the so-called primary circuit, the industrial circuit, and Jenny kind of briefly mentioned that. And of course, a major point of reference in this regard is the work of David Harvey, again drawing on Lefebvre's writings. Harvey's seminal work in the 1980s focused on how elements of the built environment play the role of spatial fixes in capitalist cycles of accumulation. And according to his famous capital switch thesis, under conditions of overaccumulation and falling rates of profit, a portion of capital will switch from sectors with short turnover times, mainly manufacturing, to sectors with long turnover times, fixed assets, namely the built environment. And this work still remains very relevant and still is discussed in the literature. Yet, in the final analysis, it still assigns urban-based accumulation an auxiliary status, in which the production of the built environment serves to absorb capital overaccumulated in the primary circuit. So I think there's still some work to be done there. Even though in a recent commentary in 2014, Harvey seems to acknowledge that there is indeed a dramatic shift between the relationship between the primary and the secondary circuit. And he says, urbanization has become the center of overwhelming economic activity on a planetary scale never before seen in human history. So what I am interested in is really to understand the extent to which there's a certain kind of a mode of mobilization, a kind of a resurgent politics that corresponds to this urban age or this urban revolution. And I suspect that the case of Turkey, and particularly the case of Istanbul, provides some insights, some clues. So now going back to the particularities of the case study that I'm proposing here, we have to understand I'll start with the political economy of the shifts that was led by the AKP government. The AKP came to power in 2002 in the immediate aftermath of a major economic crisis originating in the banking sector. And its economic policy relied largely on the facilitation of foreign capital inflows. And this was achieved by a monetary policy yielding high real interest rates, strict adherence to structural adjustments and privatization, and conjecturally speaking, the availability of liquidity in international markets. And here, you can see in this table the consistently high levels of capital flows, except the years 2009. And a lot of this is what we would call hot money, basically profile investments and also debt incurring instruments, credits. And the foreign capital rush took different forms, investment in government funds, short-term deals on the stock exchange, buyouts of private banks and public enterprises, and most significantly, loans to private sector. And it is in this context of high liquidity that real estate and infrastructure emerged as the main drivers of an increasingly debt-driven economy with very low capital saving rates. And this sort of infrastructure-led policy was also presented as benchmark of development. And some of AKP's major spatial interventions include large-scale projects such as the Third Bridge, which was recently completed, the new international airport in the northern forests of Istanbul, privatization and redevelopment of public lands and assets in central and coastal locations. And additionally, vast informal territories in the metropolitan peripheries and all building stock in central locations have been targeted by urban renewal and urban redevelopment. And there have been various place-based and issue-based mobilizations against these interventions. However, their impact remained rather limited. And initially, opposition to the Taksim redevelopment project, which was led by an umbrella organization called Taksim Solidarity, didn't seem to have broad appeal within the public at large either. And the Taksim project, and here you see a sort of general bird eye view of the area. The sort of redevelopment of the Taksim Square itself is part of a broader goal of commercializing central districts of Istanbul, and so as to maximize their potential for tourism, retail, and high-end housing. Taksim Square has historically been the preferred space for demonstrations for a variety of progressive political causes, and the adjacent Gezi Park, which you see here, was and is a refuge for poor people in the middle of a highly congested and commercialized area. So it was basically a people where, as one activist put it, where people could spend time without spending money. It was also a meeting ground for LGBT individuals in the nighttime, so it had its sort of different dynamics in the daytime and the nighttime. And it is precisely these unregulated public qualities of Taksim that the current project, which is still on the table, seeks to discipline and to replace with scripted, safe spaces of consumption. According to the plan, the square would be stripped of its function as a place of assembly, and it would strictly be a zone of consumption. So Erdogan basically wants to see cafes, a Baroque-style concert hall, a museum, and a mosque that will sort of be arranged in a way that is attractive for kind of Western tourists as well. And in the area, right before the Gezi revolt itself, a de facto demonstration ban was declared. So, I mean, just moving from this particular project, apart from commercialization and political sterilization of public space, the attempted demolition of Gezi Park also brought to the foreground questions around environmental degradation and sort of ecological issues. And indeed, the initial mobilization against the project was framed in terms of saving the trees, protecting this very rare green space. And of course, interventions in central urban areas is only one aspect of AKP's spatial policies. Peripheral towns and rural areas have also been targeted by the development model based on infrastructure and real estate. So in this regard, one highly contentious infrastructural intervention in rural areas is small hydropower plants. So these are turning some of the most remote valleys, especially in the Black Sea regions, into busy construction sites. And the AKP government has launched an aggressive program targeting 2,000 hydropower plants by 2023 to mark the centennial of the Turkish Republic. So even though the rapid diffusion of this new kind of extractive and infrastructural economies in the rural lacks an official title, as in the case of urban transformation, activists often refer to it as rural transformation. And both are perceived as twin spatial extensions of AKP's economic policies. And almost so as to affirm these perceptions, Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Public Works and Housing were merged in 2011 under the name of Ministry of Environment and Urbanization. So they basically were, but even by the authorities, they were seen as kind of more or less the same thing. urgent expropriation law has been a widely used legal tool to facilitate construction projects both in the countryside and in the cities. And many citizens found expropriation notices and compensations in their bank accounts even before they heard any rumors about projects that are being implemented. And beyond the similarities of legal tools and procedures, it is also possible to mention examples in which the logic of urban transformation is in more direct and concrete relation with these rural interventions. And one striking example is the so-called touristic urban transformation project in Hemşin, which is the tiniest county in Turkey with a population of 2,200. So when it was realized that the two small hydropower plants on a small stream of the Hemşin River would create a mini lake that would submerge some houses and businesses, the project evolved from an energy project to a real estate project, and in partnership with the Turkish Housing Development Administration, TOKİ. And one outcome of these aggressive interventions in the rural has been popularization and politicization of environmentalism, which had been up to that point mostly seen as a middle-class sensitivity and largely confined within the offices of international NGOs and mainstream environmental groups. So now basically trying to wrap this up and coming back to the main point of the extent to which these highly diverse mobilizations in rural and urban settings were able to develop a common political lexicon. One humble yet powerful phrase stands out, which is, as I mentioned, the notion of yaşam alanı, means life space. And prior to Gezi, this catchphrase was circulating among both urban and rural activists. So closely associated with, but different from the increasingly popular notion of the commons, the notion of yaşam alanı connotes spaces of refuge that have maintained a high level of autonomy from the value circuits of capital accumulation. And it also has connotations of a safe space to breathe, enjoy, and express oneself. Just as a very side note, in the Turkish phrase, when it's translated to English, life space, sounds much like some unwelcome. It has unwelcome connotations, but in the Turkish context, it really doesn't have those kind of xenophobic or exclusionary implications. So that's why we try to just stick with the Turkish phrase. So it was this common goal of defending yaşam alanı that successfully articulated various political agendas during the Gezi revolt. And the phrase was uttered countless times by the occupiers of the Gezi Park. And it was sort of really, within the park space itself, which housed hundreds of different tents, housing different political groups, such as environmentalists, feminists, Kemalists, socialists, communists, anti-capitalist Islamists, pro-Alevi, pro-LGBT, and pro-Kurdish rights groups, and football fan groups. So this was basically used as a common lexicon among these activist circles. In kind of trying to make sense of this, various kind of constellations within the Gezi Park itself, the park residents established an infirmary, nursery, library, communication office, and a vegetable garden. And in a way, they were impatiently rushing to produce and proliferate what had been under attack under an authoritarian neoliberal rule, basically their yaşam alanı. So I would be remiss if I didn't evoke Rancière. So certain moments we really found him quite useful in making sense of this kind of eruptive moment. And he argues that, I'm quoting him now, police intervention in public spaces does not consist primarily in the interpellation of demonstrators, as someone like Louis Althusser would argue, but in the breaking up of demonstrations. So the police's main job is to protect the existing spatial configuration against perceived transgressions. And according to the police, a road is for facilitating circulation and not for demonstrations. So as opposed to this, then, egalitarian and decentralized politics transforms this space by refiguring what there is to do there and what is to be seen or named therein. And as Davis argues, this entails a certain theatricality. So in the case of Gezi, then, this amounted to the performative demonstration, sort of theatrical demonstration of not only equality, but also of possible futures and lives. And this is not to claim that, this was a space free of tensions, it was this, this wonderland. I mean, perhaps we can discuss these in the discussions section. So the Gezi occupation came to an end with the police raid in June 16, after 2 weeks of occupation. And there were various attempts to revive it in its original place. There were also attempts to channel its momentum into electoral politics, even establishing a Gezi party. But these were largely unsuccessful. So the big question is: so what is left of Gezi? What did it do in its aftermath? What is left of this major event? As Swingerto argues, puts it nicely, the urgent tasks to undertake in the aftermath of riots revolve centrally around inventing new modes and practices of collective political organization, which is, of course, easier said than done. And following the revolt and the occupation, there have been piecemeal yet influential socio-spatial practices that served to extend and deepen the Gezi effect. And one very prominent example is the emergence and proliferation of various popular forums, popular assemblies, organized in public spaces. And within a week, some 65 forums were being held daily on different squares and public parks in Istanbul and in more than 50 locations across the country. In a year's time already, many forums faded, as kind of was expected, yet many others, especially those that managed to attach themselves to a place-based issue, a community garden or a train station under threat, these really kind of survived and thus contributed to the organization of the post-Gezi period. And Gezi particularly echoed in locations hurt by AKP's top-down spatial interventions. Some examples, among many others, include resistance against highway construction in the Middle East Technical University in Ankara, the defense of historic community gardens in Istanbul, and ancient Hefsel gardens in Diyarbakir, and various mobilizations that have adopted the title of defense in their organization. For instance, now there is an Istanbul-wide organization called Istanbul City Defense that is basically derived from the Gezi experience. And we could, of course, argue that in many ways, Gezi did not only open up politics, but also the urban itself in kind of, I think this speaks to this sort of certain debates around, planetarization of the urban fabric and the urban condition. I think another very crucial example, which is also very alive today, is the organization called Northern Forest Defense, which is a movement that was established in response to the plans for the third bridge and the third airport that would threaten Istanbul's northern forests. So basically, it's in solidarity with various ecological movements that are operating in the same kind of ecological zone, the Black Sea region. So basically, to wrap it up, basically, in this paper we attempted to approach the Giza Revolt from the perspective of the political work that space does, in an era when capitalism increasingly revalorizes itself through production of space in both urban and rural settings. Hardt and Negri, I mean, quite sort of inspiring quote that I find is Hardt and Negri's argument that the metropolis is to the multitude what the factory was to the industrial working class. And this, of course, echoes Lefebvre's original argument from 1970, in which he argued that urban reality can no longer be explained away as an element of the superstructure, subservient to the shifts in productive forces, as it becomes a productive force itself. So from this vantage point, Giza is perhaps the quintessential urban revolt, as it was both the cause and the means of the revolt. Cause not only in the sense of an initial instigator, but also in the sense of a legitimate cause that had the capacity to open up a profoundly political space. And as I tried to demonstrate, Giza's real potency lay in the fact that beyond a mere temporary destabilization of the established consensus, it actually demonstrated new ways of inhabiting and making space and real channels of participating in the production of space. So I'll just stop here and happy to discuss this further with questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you both, Justus and Ozan. I'll kickstart maybe the discussion with one question before I'll review my position, before opening the floor to questions and taking questions from the floor for 20 minutes. I have one question about Rancière and the theoretical discussion around this work. So are we really discussing Rancière's work here, or its interpretation by geographers and political scientists as well? Because geographers and political scientists have used Rancière in an instrumental manner, in a way, just to assess the level of openness of institutions, of quasi-institutions, of organizations in the making, such as... so it's quite useful and operational to assess, for instance, institutions around public debates or... And so is it that we are discussing, or is it really the work of Rancière, who might be a bit surprised of the way it's been used by social scientists? As you said, I mean, he doesn't really consider himself at all as being part of social science. So that's my question.
Did you want to?
I don't mind answering. I think that your question already implies an answer. Yeah, obviously we're talking mainly about interpretations and uses of Rancière's work. Since I wanted to write about these interpretations and uses of Rancière's work, I also had to read Rancière's work itself, and I also listened to his speeches. And I must say that I am not convinced by the argument that his interpreters are all completely wrong. And that Rancière is actually saying something much more sophisticated, because when I do hear him talk about protest, that sounds quite a lot like people like Swingedouw are talking about it. So the sort of line of defense for Rancièreans to say, well, maybe Swingedouw isn't entirely right, but Rancière is. I'm not really buying into that, but I must admit that I didn't really read every single book by Rancière, as some others may have done.
Okay, right. So we'll take questions from the audience. Who would like to start? Ludovic?
Two questions, one for each of our speakers. So thanks a lot for your talks. I just would like to try and reconnect more directly to the internationalization theme of the conference. So, on the one hand, so this first question is for you, Justus. You really insist on the importance of places, and it looks like it's going to be places within cities, even from what we saw in the maps you've shown, it's like more metropolises or large-scale cities. So could you just tell us a bit more about these places? Do they have particular characteristics? I mean, you insist on the importance of geography, but you don't really get into the details of those geographies. Maybe there was something about a particular place in Rotterdam, which looks like where the immigrants are. But can you tell us more about these particular geographies and how they do matter? And as for you, Ozan, so if I'm trying to think where is the international dimension in your case, it would be finance capital or money going across, and maybe some expertise, you know, with the structural adjustment policies. So it's on the side of the villains, of the bad guys. That would be international. Now, what about the good guys, people in Gezi Park? How do they? And if they do, how do they connect to other contestations across national borders? Does it mean anything for them, or is it just still very fragmented, i.e. mobilizations that are overly determined by the national and local institutions rather than being able to go across borders, just like capitalism on the other way, if I may put it that way, manages to go across the borders? So that's my question.
So thank you for your question. It's true that I mostly talked about cities. So let me first clarify that a big challenge in the book is to explain why, for instance, Amsterdam first played a major role in driving mobilizations and later it didn't. So we're not saying that cities always do this. It changes over time. And our approach is intended to explain these differences in mobilization capacities over time. Also, we don't only look at cities, we look at the relational qualities of places, so what sort of relations can form there. And it is very clear that if I look at the Dutch case, that from, say, 2010 onwards, actually small villages in rural and suburban communities became very important in immigrant rights struggles, for reasons I won't get into now. So there's, it's not that cities in general or specific cities are always continually very important for these mobilizations. So that's an important qualification, but now I am going to say why particular cities ended up there so often. So the first argument is very much analogous to the arguments of agglomeration economics. So you have like many different types of activists together who share certain knowledge, who can also develop a division of labor. So this allows them to organize fairly sustained and complex campaigns over a longer period of time. So it is not only that in cities campaigns are often more intense simply because there are more immigrants or more activists there. It's also that these cities, and specifically neighborhoods within these cities, perform particular roles, very much analogous to, say, financial districts or fashion districts, and so on. A second important aspect, if you look at immigrant rights politics, is that these areas function as, say, counter-publics. So Fraser talks about counter-publics, where people organize outside of the mainstream public sphere on the basis of an alternative identity. And these types of counter-publics have their geographical basis, and they're often found in these neighborhoods. And a last aspect that I think comes out very strongly in your presentation is that these metropolitan areas are very important as arenas. They are at the center of attention So whenever contestation is performed there, it is much more likely to attract attention and to be symbolically significant. So for all these reasons, I do think that places perform different roles, and that cities, at least historically in the cases that we studied, often performed vital for driving these long-term mobilizations.
Okay, thanks Ludovic for the questions. So about the internationalizing aspect, I guess what I mostly what I'm really sort of more interested in is the extent to which, you know, the urbanization becomes sort of generalized, it becomes a dominant, it becomes sort of organizing principle of not just the economy, but also the nationalist narratives and how that sort of animates a lot of things. But you're right. I mean, there is one element of international links is all these kind of hot money flows that have been until now it's kind of they're starting to escape, but until very recently, these hot money flows provided kind of basically they were essential for debt financing all these large infrastructure projects, and also for household debts that allowed households to buy their houses using credits from banks. So, but nonetheless, what I would argue is that if you think of it as kind of at a larger scale, really, if you're looking at the planetary scale, and I'm just to quickly plug a new project I'm starting. I'm actually kind of starting a new project. I just started a new project on this international and dimensions of these different configurations. But it seems to me that compared to a case like London, where a lot of these international links, the investors, the fund manager, different funds are quite visible. In the case of Istanbul, these are quite very difficult to trace, and they're in my understanding, they're quite weak actually. So there's no kind of direct investment by big funds or asset managers. But to come back to this kind of mobilization side of it, the extent to which there were international perhaps influences or cross fertilizations. One thing when we were doing this research, we thought that because in Gezi Park, as you can see in this picture, there were these tents. It looked like Occupy movement from 2011. We said, oh, okay, they probably just took these from there must have been some kind of inspiration. But then when we inquired about this, a lot of people who kind of first installed their tents there explained that, well, actually, what, this comes from mobilizations in the rural areas. That's where we were doing it there, and then we thought, because we had to camp in outdoor settings, we needed tents, so we just basically brought it here. So it was not so clear what kind of dynamics were in play in that regard as well. But definitely within the space itself, there were people coming from the Greek squares, from Spain. So there was definitely a lot of encounter between different mobilizations, different settings.
Francisca?
Yeah, thank you to both of you. I have a question for Justus. I would like us to tell a little bit more about the interplay between this contentious milieu or contentious area, as you just defined that, and this kind of more global and virtual network of open access activism. Mm-hmm. And my question would be about the interplay between the two of them, because if I understood you well, you said that somehow these local networks, they nourish the virtual ones and the other way around. So if you could develop a little bit more and about how, for instance, if we use the resource mobilization theory or from social movement theory, do these global networks function as resources for the local ones at some point, and how? And the other way around, do the local one, well, you said the local one functions as resources, but how the global one function as resources at the local level in the protest event and also beyond them? Because I was very interested when you talk about the fact that these Instagram about they came from segregated area. So I was wondering whether or not the fact of belonging or joining at some point some form of activists on these networks have an effect on the way these individuals politicize or engage in local networks. And no, I also have a question for Ozan, sorry. It is about the maybe I misunderstood you, but I was wondering whether or not in this political economy of this investment in Turkey, are infrastructure and real estate investments exactly the same? I mean, you know, is the same thing building a pipeline or a water treatment plant and investing things in new fancy homes and offices? And I don't know, it's a question.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So let me first start by how Manuel Castells sees this interplay of urban and online spaces. So Castells argues that these that the squares that the Indignados occupied and also the Gezi resistance, that these are particular spaces created by the protesters to form their sort of autonomous space, independent from power, where they develop their own discourses. Then he talks about online spaces in much the same way. So he is arguing that social media is a particularly fertile place for all sorts of resistances and criticism to develop. And then he argues that these two interact, that people interject the ideas that they develop on the squares into social media, and conversely that people see on social media certain discourses that they can employ locally. So at first I was rather convinced by this argument, and I see that many activists also try to use both urban and online mobilizations for these purposes. So let me just give one example. If you look at Black Lives Matter, they're very explicit in saying that it's local groups that should undertake all sorts of actions. And what the Black Lives Matter hashtag then does is create connections across all these different types of mobilizations, which take place in different localities and for different sorts of issues. So it can be about police violence, but it can also be about all sorts of other forms of discrimination. So in that sense, the hashtag creates a degree of coherence. It opens up a space for communication, and in that sense it also offers resources for local activists, because they can use these talking points, these hashtags, to label, perhaps even brand, their own local specific protest. They can become part of something bigger. So this would be the ideal case. What in reality very often happens is that when mobilizations grow bigger, then opponents start hijacking those hashtags. So when we looked at the Not One More campaign, it hardly happened that there were critics, but there were also only 100,000 Twitter messages. When you look at Black Lives Matter, there are millions and millions of messages, but you also see that people very much intervene in those spaces. So in that sense, Castells is definitely not correct in believing that social media are always or necessarily a sort of autonomous space where activists can deliberate among themselves. It can be an incredibly hostile place, and can also be very incredibly demotivating for activists to deal with those hashtags. So I think he's right in many ways, but I think if you now look at these dynamics of mobilizations, then you would have to at least arrive at a more nuanced understanding.
So yeah, just to briefly respond to your question about the difference between real estate infrastructure. Yeah, you're right. They definitely follow a distinct financial infrastructures, to quote a phrase by Ludovic. So they have different kind of they have different sort of channels in which through which they're financed. But still, the thing is, one, of course, major factor that prevent small players entering real estate is that these projects are usually huge. Constructing the third bridge, the new airport. So in these kinds of projects, small players are kind of eliminated. So you can't really. But the AKP government seems to have somehow solved this problem as well through this small dam projects across the countryside. So these are really small contractors, relatively small contractors, could undertake these investments as well. You know, as I said, they're planning 2,000 of those ones just right across the countryside. So and when you look at firms operating now, there's this we have these hybrid kind of firms that are emerging which have close ties to the government, and there are some actually great online sources you can trace these networks. There are some mapping networks that traces different firms and their relation to the government, and they operate simultaneously in big infrastructure projects, real estate, dam projects, and big media groups. So it's just like you have these bundles of groups that are just basically kind of are very, very influential in three major spheres that are kind of dominant in the Turkish context now. So it's very, very tight.
So thank you. I think we'll stop there unless there was last question. Yeah. So Jenny.
Nobody's hungry anyway, so.
No, it's fine. Yeah. Can survive.
I had a question. I like very much the Ozan's point. He said here. Thanks. I liked Ozan's point where he's asking what is the specificity of the social movements in relation to the development model. So the development model being this, rather corrupt version of massive speculative development, state-led investment, hot money, financialization, and so on. So, and this is a common question for lots of cities. So I guess that's my question. So what is distinctive about the movements we see now? So you mentioned about the city as a site for mobilization as compared to the factory and so on, which you ascribe to Hart and Negri, but in fact we read this in Castells as well.
Yes.
So what is the meaning of social movements? They're not collective consumption-oriented social movements against state capitalism or the welfare state. Well, how do we catch what's meaningful about them now? And I think perhaps it is this fact that our shared public spaces and the quality of urban life is being evacuated by the kinds of developments that are resulting and the capacity to open up so much of the city to very large-scale intensification and development. So I just wonder if there's something there about what is being contested and how it's being contested that is distinctive, even if it doesn't internationalize itself, but is really embedded in local networks to be effective. What is the meaning of it within this broader context of internationalization of urban development?
Okay. Yeah, that's yeah. Okay. Of course, I'm not going to offer a complete answer to this question because that's the big question for me as well. That's sort of the. But perhaps a few smaller. We can break it down to smaller questions. I could do. But one thing that seems to be crucial is that a big fundamental question for me is, as you kind of also raised. When you look at these various mobilizations that are happening across major cities that are actually contesting these kinds of speculative interventions in space, they seem to be very, very locally embedded, and kind of international linkages or global linkages are quite weak. In Europe there are some kind of efforts, mostly led by Spain because they are so cool in this realm, but yeah, it remains rather patchy. But then this raises the question: well, actually, do we need the internationalization of these movements? Maybe because investments are internationalizing, or because there is a certain financialization, internationalization logic to it. Does that necessarily mean that the movements also have to be kind of somehow international? Or do they really have to somehow address the particular configuration, which is not necessarily so so open to global flows. So for me, that's that's kind of that's a major question. And I guess, you know, again, I'm just improvising a little bit here. I guess in terms of the specificity of what we're seeing across, you know, across the cities, across cities in the world, perhaps, you know, this occupation style kind of really movements that are really oriented towards claiming and making claims through, you know, appropriation of space. I think that seems to be, at least, I mean, we could perhaps at least, you know, take that as one fundamentally unique aspect of, you know, mobilizations against the commonwealth of, you know, our urban commonwealth in a way. So, but I'll leave it at that. Maybe just this will solve this problem for us. No?
Yeah, we'll maybe. Oh, just as you wanted to answer as well.
No. I will let people go to lunch.
Okay, so we'll. And now, when the lunch is.